There are 4 teams on bye this week: the Patriots, Niners, Giants, and Panthers. So there's a good chance you'll need to start some players you normally wouldn't. I've got 8 sleepers to help you navigate week 14. First guy up is Adonai Mitchell going up against the Miami Dolphins. So this might feel like chasing points a little bit after he just went 8 for 102 and a touchdown, but he's coming off a 7-target game the week prior, and he's on the field for 85% of the snaps. And, he's someone that we've had on a couple Beat the Waiver Wire episodes after joining the Jets just because of how immensely talented he is. Looking back, before the NFL trade deadline, Adonai Mitchell is a player where it felt like a trade was almost inevitable, almost as if to just do right by the young, talented player. We all remember the bonehead move he made earlier in the season, dropping that would-be 80-yard touchdown week 4 against the Rams that led to a touchback, and from there, it was all but over. Not to mention that coincided with, Alec Pierce breaking out and, probably an inevitable extension with the Colts working on the outside. A couple years ago when we did our top 10 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 class, and we had my buddy on who knows a heck of a lot more about scouting than I do, he was comparing Adonai Mitchell to CeeDee Lamb in the way he gets in and out of his breaks. And we know that separation has not been an issue with him. It's just been about putting it all together. And we finally saw that happen this past week against the Falcons. And now looking to this week specifically, going up against the Dolphins at home, still no Garrett Wilson. Dolphins are about middle of the pack in terms of defense against the pass, but they should be able to put up points against the Jets defense and force Tyrod Taylor to throw the ball upwards of 30 times. And looking at the bigger picture, it is absolutely in the Jets' best interest to keep featuring Mitchell. They have their cornerstone piece with Garrett Wilson, but if Mitchell is someone they think that can be their wide receiver 2 of the future, it's in everyone's best interest to keep building on last week's momentum. Next up, Jakobi Meyers going up against the Colts. So Jakobi was someone that we were kind of all in on this offseason. He's been one of the most underrated fantasy assets the previous 3 seasons, and the thought was new coaching staff, upgrade at quarterback. We'd already seen him finish the wide receiver 23 with Brock Bowers, but it just didn't work out. And looking back, he had requested a trade going back into the offseason and wasn't shy about wanting to get moved leading up to the deadline. So maybe he was dogging it a little bit before that. Maybe not, but the Raiders situation obviously proved to be a disaster this year. And, last week was the first time we got to see him on the field with Brian Thomas, and the first time we got to see him on the field with BTJ and Strange. And once again, he got his usual 6 targets, catching each of them for 90 yards and a score. And that was to BTJ's 2 catches on 3 targets for 28 yards. And this week they get the Colts, who are down Sauce Gardner, which will help this passing attack overall. The Colts should also be able to put up points against the Jags. It's a projected high scoring game as well. It's the 3rd highest over under on the week. And, as much as we're not fans of Trevor Lawrence, he's actually been playing pretty good recently, so I wouldn't be afraid to go back to the well with Jakobi this week. Next up is Alec Pierce against the Jags. So sticking with the same game on the opposite side of the ball is Alec Pierce. And, we know that there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense, but if you're fighting for your playoff life and you want to go down swinging, Alec Pierce always has the potential for a big game. And the fact that he's only 66% rostered is actually a little bit surprising. And Pierce is on the field for over 90% of the snaps, is the big play threat in this offense who Daniel Jones clearly trusts. And we've already seen him have double-digit target games. And the reason I wanted to include him on here is, the Colts have an implied team total of 25 points. Jacksonville is one of the best run defenses in the league. In fact, they allow the fewest rush yards per game in the NFL and are much softer against the pass. And, if your argument is, well, it's Jonathan Taylor, I'm on your side, but we have to at least consider the last 2 weeks against tough defenses. JT has not been as dominant. So also, side note, if you're into the psychology of putting fear into your opponent, Pierce is in that bucket of guys like JMO or Christian Watson, where you are sweating facing them because they can just rip a 50-yard touchdown at any moment. Moving over to the running back position, first guy up is Devin Neal going up against the Bucs. So 17 touches in his first NFL start last week. Didn't do a whole lot with him, but the encouraging thing is the last few weeks is his involvement in the receiving game. Only 3 catches last week, but 5 the week prior. So if he gets 5 targets this week, along with 12 to 15 carries, you can do much worse than a spot start in a pinch. Last week, Taysom Hill was wholly uninvolved, and I personally learned that Evan Hull was the team's 4th-string running back. And looking at Neal's prospect profile, he was a 6th-round pick out of Kansas, was never a guy that was going to test well. And, especially in a deep running back class, led to him kind of falling. But he was a 4-star recruit. He played baseball for the Jayhawks as well for a couple seasons. And, he was Kansas's all-time leading rusher in terms of yards and touchdowns. And, I don't necessarily care what your 40 time is. That's just pretty dang impressive. And he's someone that I personally had ahead of RJ Harvey in the pre-draft process. I know Sean Payton wouldn't agree with me there, but what do I know? So maybe I'm just wish casting here a little bit, but I think given the potential opportunity and the amount of teams on bye, you can do worse than the volume of Devin Neal. Next up, Chris Rodriguez going up against the Vikings. So he continues to show he's the lead back in Washington, and he doesn't catch passes. So if you're in a full PPR, would probably turn elsewhere, like even maybe like a Tajay Spears type, if you just really want that floor. But he also has a nose for the end zone, scoring 4 out of his last 6 games. And, Denver was a tough matchup last week, but this week he gets the Vikings, who are much more of a run funnel and are stingier against the pass. And not to mention, the Vikings offense isn't exactly a juggernaut right now. So this projects to be a pretty even matchup, with the potential kicker being if Jaden Daniels comes back. But I think Mariota has done enough to prove that he's a strong backup regardless. So if you're looking for a guy, deeper in the rankings who has a pretty good chance of getting in the end zone, I think Chris Rodriguez can have some fine appeal this week. And I think as a stash, for later in the season, again, if you're fighting for a fantasy championship, you're probably not hoping to bank on Chris Rodriguez. But this late in the year, finding lead backs is pretty rare. So there's a chance he might even be on your waiver. Next up, Jordan Mason going up against Washington. So this is contingent upon Aaron Jones' availability this week. If he can't go, then Jordan Mason becomes a strong spot start, in my opinion. And, he's been pretty efficient the last few weeks, albeit on limited carries. And, last week the team had to abandon the run because the Seahawks were just demolishing them. But, the betting markets currently project this one to be a coin flip. So in a neutral game script or even a positive game script, I would expect them to lean on Mason in the event of Jones' absence. If anything, just to take the ball out of JJ McCarthy's hands as much as possible. At least JJ McCarthy, we know now, is an upgrade over Brosmer, but I digress on that. And, we do have a small sample size from weeks 3 through 7 when Jones was out and Mason averaged 15 carries per game with some involvement in the receiving game. And the icing on the cake here for this matchup specifically is, Washington is one of the worst defensive units in the league. So if Jordan gets runway for 15 to 20 touches, if Jones is out, I think he can have a really strong game this week. At the tight end position, I have Darren Waller going up against the New York Jets. So no doubt it feels like tight end has been much better this year than years past. But unless you have a top dog, in which case this section will not be relevant to you, you still pretty much need a touchdown to eclipse 10 half PPR points. And, that's where Darren Waller steps in, right? Like, he's been hurt most of the season, isn't going to be on the field a ton, but has made the most of his limited opportunities. He's caught 12 passes in 4 games, and 4 of those have gone for touchdowns. And, last week was the only game without a touchdown that he's played, and he still went for 47 yards on 2 catches. And, I get the touchdown efficiency isn't sustainable argument, but he's also the big body target in the red zone. And we have a pretty good precedent from last season with Tua and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine running hot on scores down there. So I think if you're hunting for some touchdown upside at the tight end position, Darren Waller is someone that you can turn to and probably is available on your waiver wire. At the quarterback position, more so for our Superflex audience, but for those of you who are in 1 QB leagues who are missing May or Dart or Purdy this week, like, Tyrod Taylor might be an interesting option to turn to, right? In his 3 full games this season, he scored 16, 13, and 21 fantasy points, and he's thrown 5 touchdowns across those 3 games to only 2 interceptions, and he adds a nice floor with his legs as well. And, I talked about Adonai Mitchell early in the episode, so maybe this is doubling down here a little bit, which may not be the best idea when it is the Jets, but considering this is a sleeper video, digging a little bit deeper here in your 1 QB leagues if you're stuck, or your Superflex leagues if you have a matchup that you don't really like this week from your second QB, I think Tyrod, you can do worse than him. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.